In this video, I'm going to explain intervals in the simplest way possible. You'll learn what intervals are, why they're important to learn, and how to think about them. Intervals are the building blocks of music, and the most important topic to learn in music theory. Before you try to learn the theory behind chords, scales, or modes, it's a good idea to first learn intervals. Let's start at what an interval is. An interval is the space between two notes. There's a lot of jargon and confusing language used when talking about intervals. To put it in simple terms, an interval is the gap between two notes. Different sized gaps between the notes have different names. We use different interval names to describe the different sounds we hear. Here is an example of an interval. You heard two notes. Intervals are always two notes. The first note you heard we call the root note. You may have heard the name root note from chords and scales. The root note is our starting point. Let's hear a different interval. This time we have the same root note, but the second note is different. This is a different type of interval because the distance between the notes has changed. In the first example, the distance between the two notes was 1 fret on the guitar. There are a few different names for this distance you will hear, but they all mean the same thing. Half step, half tone, or semitone all mean an interval of 1 fret distance on the guitar. As a guitarist, you might count distances between notes in how many frets. In music theory, we count the distance in semitones. It's the same thing. The second interval you heard has a distance of 2 frets on the guitar. We could count this as 2 semitones, 2 half steps, or 2 half tones. As you might guess, instead of saying 2 half steps, we can say a whole step. Instead of 2 half tones or 2 semitones, we can say a whole tone. So far, here are the main points to remember. An interval is the distance between any two notes. We measure intervals with semitones or half steps. 1 semitone or half step is the same as 1 fret distance on guitar. 2 semitones make a whole tone and 2 half steps make a whole step. Finally, we call the starting note of an interval the root note. Now let's look at how we can play intervals. The two interval examples you heard are melodic intervals. This is when we play an interval one note at a time. Think of a melody. In a melody you hear one note at a time. They're all melodic intervals. Here are some examples of different melodic intervals. As you can hear, each interval is different and they all sound different, but they were all melodic intervals. The other way we can play intervals is by playing both notes at the same time. We call this harmonic intervals. Here are a few examples of harmonic intervals. As you can hear, they all sound different. Any two notes played together is a harmonic interval. You might even think of what you heard as chords. That's what I meant earlier when I said that intervals are the building blocks of music. Harmonic intervals are the building blocks of chords, and melodic intervals are the building blocks of scales. You'll learn more about chords and scales later. Now that you know what melodic and harmonic intervals are, let's look at the names we use for intervals. We name intervals in two parts, a number and a quality. This is where it can get confusing, so I'll keep it as simple as possible. If you're not familiar with note names, it might help to watch my video explaining how note names work. It will make it easier to understand intervals. We number intervals from how many note letters it covers. For example, if we have an interval with the notes A and B, that's 2 letters, so we call that a second. If the interval is A and C, that covers 3 letters, so we call it a third. This also works for sharp and flat notes. If the interval is from A to C sharp, that's 3 letters, so we call it a third. Pretty simple, right? All you need to do is count how many note names the interval covers and put a number on it. But you might notice something odd about the last two examples I gave. The interval A to C is a third, but A to C sharp is also a third. How can they both be thirds when they're different intervals? This is where quality comes in. The interval quality is the fancy name we give for how intervals sound. Let's hear two intervals and compare how they sound. Here are the notes A and C played together as a harmonic interval. Now here are A and C sharp played together as a harmonic interval. It's clear they're different intervals and sound different. How would you try and describe these two intervals by how they sound? Here they are again back to back. Some people might say that the first example is dark while the second example is bright, while other people might say the first one is moody or sad, while the second example is cheery or happy. There's a lot of ways we could describe these qualities, which could make things confusing really quickly. To make it easier to talk about intervals, we use labels to describe how intervals sound. The first example you heard, we say has a minor quality. The second example we say has a major quality. You might recognize these terms from major and minor chords or major and minor scales. So while both intervals are thirds, we separate them by their quality. The first interval you heard from A to C we call a minor third. The second example from A to C sharp we call a major third. I know this can be a bit confusing at first, so here is a recap of the most important points to remember. We name intervals with a number and a quality. The number is how many note letters the interval covers. The quality is how we describe the sound of the interval. Mapping out all 12 notes will help you understand how all these interval names work. If we use A as our root note, the 12 notes in order are A sharp, B, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp. Then let's finish by returning to A as our 13th note. We could go further, but this is more than enough to get you started. Now that we have all our notes mapped out, we can number the intervals. Starting as A as 1, we count the letters to get the interval numbers. So for example, C and C sharp covers 3 letters, A, B, C. So we label both of those intervals as thirds. F and F sharp covers 6 letters, so we label them as sixths. Finally, when we get to A, that covers 8 letters, so we label that as an eighth. There's one problem though. We mapped out the notes using sharps. What if we use flats instead? Let's find out. If we map out the notes using flats instead of sharps, we get A, B flat, B, C, D flat, D, E flat, E, F, G flat, G, A flat, and then A. Now let's fill in the numbers again based on how many letters we cover. Almost all the notes match up as before, but a couple stand out. I know this is confusing, but I want to keep this as simple as possible. There's one interval that has 2 different names. The interval where there's an overlap of a 4th and a 5th, D sharp and E flat, has 2 names. We'll look at that later when we get to quality. The point to remember is that they're both right. It can be a 4th or a 5th, just like the note can either be D sharp or E flat. The other issue is where there is an overlap between 1 and 2 and 7 and 8. These need to change. There's only one first interval and only one 8th interval. So we change the other first to a 2nd and the other 8th to a 7th. Don't worry if it doesn't make sense yet, it will later on. Now let's look at quality. Remember that each interval has a number and a quality. You already know 2 qualities. I mentioned major and minor qualities earlier, so let's start there. Only certain intervals can have major or minor quality. Those intervals are seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths. So let's label all of those intervals as major or minor. So which one's which? Always remember that major is 1 fret higher than minor, and you'll be right. This means if you're playing a minor interval and want to change to a major interval, all you need to do is move the note up 1 fret. So we label C as a minor third and C sharp as a major third. If we look at sixths, we label F as the minor 6th and F sharp as the major 6th. G is the minor 7th and G sharp is the major 7th. Finally, A sharp is the minor 2nd and B is the major 2nd. We have a couple of gaps here, and these intervals use different names for quality. Apart from our tricky interval in the middle of 4th and 5th, we call all the other intervals perfect intervals. So the 5th becomes a perfect 5th, the 4th becomes a perfect 4th, the 1st becomes a perfect 1st, but we call it the perfect unison, or unison for short. Finally, the 8th becomes the perfect 8th, which we call the octave. Let's look at that tricky interval that's left over. The interval where there's an overlap of a fourth and a fifth, D sharp and E flat, has two names. One name is augmented fourth, the other name is diminished fifth. So in this case, we call the A to D sharp interval an augmented fourth, and A to E flat a diminished fifth. I know it's confusing and the complicated names don't help. In truth, it doesn't really matter what you call it. The main point to remember is that it's the same interval. It has two names, but it's still the same distance between the notes. At this point, you might be a bit annoyed with how we name intervals. I don't blame you, it's confusing at first. But let's look at why we use these names, then look at why intervals are so important. The different quality names try to make it easier to talk to each other about how an interval sounds. Instead of trying to say an interval sounds dark or moody, which means different things to different people, we say it has a minor quality. Instead of saying it sounds bright or happy, we say it has a major quality. What about those perfect intervals? We call them perfect intervals because of how stable they sound. The unison, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, and octave are all very stable sounding intervals. As a guitarist, you already know the sound of a perfect fifth. Here's the perfect fifth played as a harmonic interval. Sound familiar? You might recognize it as a power chord. If you've ever seen a power chord written as something like E5, now you know what that means. The 5 after the note name tells us to play a perfect fifth interval. So you already have some idea on how useful intervals are. Some of these intervals, like the perfect fifth, you use all the time without knowing what they are. As you strengthen your understanding of music theory and of intervals, you'll develop a stronger understanding of the music you play. Okay, so I've hit you with a lot of confusing names and labels in this video, so let's have a quick look at why it's so important to learn. I mentioned at the start of this video that intervals are the building blocks of music. Well, what does that mean? If they're building blocks, let's stack a few of them together. Let's play a minor third harmonic interval and stack a major third harmonic interval on top of it. If our root note is A, a minor third above that would be C. If we want to stack a major third on top of that, a major third above C is E. So we end up with 3 notes, A, C, and E. If we play all 3 notes together, this is what we get. We end up with a very common chord, the A minor chord. But let's switch things up. Let's start with A, play a major third on top of that, then stack on top of it a minor third. The notes we would end up with would be A, C sharp, and E, and sounds like this. This time, by switching the intervals around, we end up with another common chord, the A major chord. So stacking intervals on top of each other and playing them as harmonic intervals lets us build any chord we want. This is something I explain in full in my video on chords, so let's look at something else. What if we string intervals together one after another, or melodically? We end up with something like this. What you just heard is the C major scale, and it was created just by stringing intervals together in a certain order. This is something I cover in my video on scales. Chords and scales are only the starting point for using intervals. Everything you hear in music is built using intervals. This also means you can understand almost everything in music by breaking it down into intervals. Ever heard a chord and wanted to use something like that in your own music? Take a look at the intervals and you can recreate it wherever you want in any key. Ever heard a solo and wondered why it sounded so good? Take a look at the intervals and you'll uncover its secrets. If this is the first time you've looked into intervals, it might feel overwhelming. But don't worry, because it will gradually make more and more sense over time. As you learn about scales and chords, you'll strengthen your understanding of intervals. Here are the main points to remember before moving on to other topics. Intervals are the building blocks of music. An interval is the distance between any 2 notes. Different intervals have different names and different qualities such as major, minor, and perfect. There's a lot more we could look at with intervals, but this is plenty to get you started. You can now continue to my other videos to learn about how you can use intervals to create chords or scales. Learning to create chords and scales from intervals will give you a lot of control over what you play on guitar. I recommend checking out my video on scales next, but you can jump straight to the chords video if you want. For a downloadable intervals cheat sheet, as well as more examples and explanations, follow the link in the description. On my website, you can even enroll in a free online course I've created if you want to learn music theory in a course format. If you found this video useful, please let me know by liking and commenting below. You can get more videos like this by subscribing now.